falls into two methodological frameworks. Let's see, how am I going to do this? Yeah. Okay. On the one hand, scholars examine the history of photographic practice itself. This emerges as a combined history of technological improvement, new business and commercial opportunities, and the biographies of individual photographers and their engagement by the state. On the other hand, photography often serves as an illustration for primarily textual narratives enabled through documentary archives. But what if instead we think about how the image helps us interpret ambivalences and contradictions that emerge through texts? This paper tries to do this by thinking about how we can interpret two segments of the Ottoman Photographic Archive sponsored by the state. So it looks at how photographs function in the interstices between an isolated formal history of the image and an illustrative relationship with text, and offers a supplementary interpretation of contradicting elements in modern Ottoman imperial identity. Two primary collections comprise the archive of state-sponsored Ottoman photographic self-presentation in the international sphere, an album of costumes produced in honor of the Vienna International Exhibition of 1873, and 51 albums of photographs collated from the vast photographic records produced for Sultan Abdülhamid II for presentation at the Chicago World's Fair in 1893, which were subsequently donated to the United States Library of Congress, and it's thanks to them that we still have access to these images, and to the British Library the following year. Comparison of the strategies of photographic self-representation in these two archives across the imperial taxonomies of people and territory suggests shifting interpretations of how to best represent the Ottoman Empire in relation to its own practices of modernity with the West and with an ongoing reinscription of imperial identity. The elbise Osmaniye, Les costumes populaires de la Turquie, written by the young Osman Hamdi, at the time Deputy Commissioner of the exhibition, and Victor-Marie Delaunay, a French artist and amateur historian working in the Ministry of Trade and Public Works under the direction of Osman Hamdi's father, Ibrahim al-Ethem Pasha, fit within a tripartite structure of self-representation deployed to inexpensively supplement the reduced architectural self-presentation of the Ottoman Empire at the 1873 Vienna International Exhibition. In displaying high proficiency in contemporary methodologies and discursive practices, it was one of three carefully researched and published texts which effectively projected the successful incorporation of modern epistemologies in the Ottoman Empire as reformed through the era of the Tanzimat, an era of bureaucratization and modernization programs that had transformed the state since its introduction in 1826 and its reiteration in 1856. So of these three works, there was the book about Ottoman architecture. There was also a book about Istanbul that emphasized the Byzantine era. I'm skipping through because the paper will be too long otherwise. And this fit within these three texts. It was the only one to make extensive use of photography. The other is used a lot of illustration and technical drawing. Unlike the other works, which harnessed European representational practices of colonial territories in a display of knowledge as power, the Elbise Osmaniye offered a vision of collective identity that directly contradicted the dominant trope of regional dress as a sign of national identity by implicating the diversity indicated by costume within a unity of the Ottoman imperial state. It thus embodied a complicated bridge between contemporary discourses of national identity, in which shared dress indicated national cohesion, and contemporary European colonial representational practices in which diversity of ethnicity, religion, and dress served as a metonymic indicator of global colonial might. Unlike the French or British empires, at this time at their heights, which used such diversity to celebrate military and economic prowess under the guise of civilizational tutelage, the Ottoman Empire had to harness the diversity within an existing state already diminishing in the face of regional nationalisms in order to project a revised imperial identity as a modern colonial empire. As in post-revolutionary France, the Tanzimat reforms had transformed the meaning of clothing in the empire. No longer a legislated regulator of rank, class, and religious community affiliation, it introduced Western-inspired neutral bureaucratic costume that could, at least in theory, be worn by any Ottoman subject. This ethos of equality under the law was underscored in 1869 with the Ottoman Law of Nationality, which for the first time defined the Ottoman citizen with no reference to religion. Elsewhere in Europe, this liberation of sartorial codes from state-enforced segregation had led to an increasing reliance on top-down enactments of dress as a means of inscribing broad national over regional identities. And in this photograph, which is the first photograph in the album, you can see the Ottoman bureaucrat. He's one of the only characters who's wearing modern dress, and the rest of the book is relatively anachronistic. It says, well, you know, only bureaucrats really wear this, and this isn't really what people are wearing. So it projects a little bit into the past. There's a certain amount of nostalgia which takes place. In the Ottoman Empire, the construction of self through the reification of regional dress was much more complex than in Europe. Reflecting a doubly inscribed overlay of European modernity, represented through the institution of non-indigenous bureaucratic dress, with the transformation of a traditional imperial identity into a modern colonial one. Thus, at the very same moment that the Ottoman self had to define itself through the other, it also had to subsume its diversity into a vision of a modern, unified state.
Sorry. Apparently. Sorry, press enter.
Let's see. Sorry. I need to move forward. It's not changing slides?
It should be.
It's not.
Oh.
Sorry.
It's always a problem.
This one I don't know how to fix.
It should move it.
Yeah, I know it should.
Yep.
There we go.
Yep.
Excellent. Lovely. Perfect. Accompanied by explanatory text elucidating the fabrics, cost, and functionality of diverse costumes of the empire, the 74 plates of the Elbise Osmaniye sartorially represent religious and ethnographic diversity through the geographic taxonomy of empire, the European territories, the Aegean Mediterranean islands, and the Aegean African territories. Thus, although the images emphasize the preservation of religious ethnographic identity within each region, the taxonomy casts the Ottoman Empire as a colonial empire, implicitly comparable to the territorial expanse of European empires, such as Britain or France. One thing I find very fascinating with these photographs, which you should get an idea of in these images, is they usually bring together people of various communities very self-consciously and in a way that's probably not terribly realistic. So there's really an idea of these people coexist side by side. And having grown up, you know, in the 80s and the 90s, this was a kind of image which was often projected by the moderate right. You know, we were all hand in hand once, let's be hand in hand again kind of thing. So there's some of these images, one will come up a little bit later, which are sort of 100 years old, but strangely politically familiar. Like the European deployment of costume in the definition of nation, this vision of modern empire relies on anachronism that can be understood as simultaneously catering to Western Orientalist desire for the romantic picturesque and to contemporary revisionist interpretations of the modernizing Tanzimat reforms. The self-conscious anachronism of the work emerges from texts of both the introduction and the first plate. The authors begin by recapitulating the distinction drawn between costume and clothing at the Paris World's Fair of 1867 as benefiting society by allowing its ethnic equalization and homogeneity, while simultaneously detracting from the social solidarity offered through communal sartorial distinction. In his study of the work, Ahmet Ersoy suggests that this self-conscious anachronism that hearkened to the pre-Tanzimat era aimed to, quote, not only present a realistic and consummate picture of the diverse Ottoman polity to the local international viewers, but that it would also surpass and correct the Orientalist generalizations and inaccuracies ingrained within common European perceptions of the Ottoman Empire. Reflecting on a writing style that, quote, approaches the highly propagandistic tone of tourism brochures, Ersoy describes how the vast variety presented in the album that brings together religious, class, and regional distinctions, quote, renders obsolete the fixed and generic types of the exotic genre, unquote, an effect underscored by the avoidance of any gestures of the picturesque or of ceremonial characterizing European costume albums. Ersoy observes that, quote, the sole purpose of these models, frozen in the sterile void, is to provide an accurate and realistic representation of the exquisite samples of Ottoman sartorial craft. If the albums thus transferred interest in exotic diversity towards attention to exquisite textiles, it thus contributed to the ultimate objective of supporting Ottoman trade interests with Europe. Indeed, many of the texts include commentary on the very reasonable prices of regional dress, leaving the modern reader wondering how this pricing information was to be of use to the intended audience of the work, presumably attending the Vienna Exposition. That is, there's a price for, say, the boatman's costume costs such and such and such, and you're like, is it for sale? Is that how much he bought it for? Is that how much he'd pay the tailor? You know, it's rather unclear what that cost actually means. Ersoy affiliates the work with the politics of the era by framing it within the reforms instituted by Fuat and Mithat Pasha in 1862, which, quote, aimed to bind the potentially centrifugal ethnic and religious groups in the empire under the central authority of the state by affording them certain rights of representation, unquote, under which the major religious groups, Greek Orthodox, Armenian, and Jewish, were enabled to build independent constitutions. He thus interprets the visual diversity of the album as subsumed within its imperial structure, presenting a model of unity within diversity parallel with the dominant contemporary vision of the modern post-Tanzimat bureaucratic Ottoman state. Ersoy's interpretation thus explains the anachronistic vision of the work by suggesting that the album aimed to correct European misconceptions of the empire by embedding modified information within a recapitulation of European nostalgia for a pre-modern appearance in the process of planned and inevitable obsolescence. Rather than representing the empire's modernity directly, the album used the visual rhetoric of image to frame this anachronism as a modern act, and thus to frame the Ottoman state as a modern imperial state taking inventory of its dominion. While this may account for part of the discrepancy between contemporary reforms aimed at an increasingly bureaucratic state that homogenized ethnic difference under a unitary vision of empire, this indirect representation of the modern seems to visually underscore the opposite of the modernist ideology that it supposedly upholds. Would visitors to the costume exhibit in Vienna, viewing mannequins clothed in elaborate regional and ethnic dress, guarded by mannequins wearing Janissary military garb outlawed in 1826, recognize these as representations of the past, or affiliate them with an imaginary Ottoman present? Rather, the average visitor, like the average consumer of this text, would understand the visual as an accurate rendition of the contemporary empire. Rather than strengthening it, this vision contradicted what Osama Mektesi described as the official nationalism launched in the wake of the Tanzimat as a project of modernization that strove to cohere different ethnic groups, different religious communities, different regions, and above all, different stages of progress within a unified Ottoman modernity. Thus, the emphasis on regionalism, ethnic diversity, and religious multiplicity, enabled through self-conscious anachronism in the Elbise Osmaniye, presented an alternative view of Ottoman imperial identity, incorporating a critique of the Tanzimat and hearkening to Ottoman traditions as a model for modern identity. In part, this approach reflects a vision Usama Makdisi labels Ottoman Orientalism. He explains that, quote, Ottoman modernization supplanted an established discourse of religious subordination by a notion of temporal subordination in which an advanced imperial center reformed and disciplined backward peripheries of a multi-ethnic and a multi-religious empire. In the album, modern tropes such as the objective ethnographic photography taken from a uniform distance, the modern interior backdrop indicated by the chair rail on the wall behind the subjects of Edhem Pasha's home where the photographs were taken, and the careful selection of models conforming to European conventions of Eastern types reinforced the distinction between the Ottoman state representing the populations under its dominion. Thus, the very absence of the masters of the empire in their European-style bureaucratic dress represents their equivalence with European colonial masters of other empires. Makdisi argues that, quote, this process culminated in the articulation of a modern Ottoman Turkish nation that had to lead the empire's other putatively stagnant ethnic and national groups into an Ottoman modernity. Indeed, in his interactions with the Ottoman hinterland, Osman Hamdi frequently distinguished between an idealized Ottoman classical past, such as that depicted in the book on architecture at the Vienna World's Fair, and, quote, primitive, superstitious, lowly, and religiously confused Arab inhabitants. And he describes the necessary act of civilizing the primitive peoples documented in the Elbise-i Osmaniye. The contrast between the European interior and the bare feet of the Hijazi Arab, in contrast to the urban elite of the Hijaz, in these photographs, underscores such an evaluation. Yet rather than reflecting a direct application of existing tropes of the Tanzimat, the publications associated with the 1873 Vienna Exposition also seem to incorporate a critique, an alternative vision of Ottoman identity that emphasizes an idealized Ottoman past as a model for contemporary modernization. Articulated most clearly in the book on architecture, the anachronism of the Elbise-i Osmaniye also seems to advocate for a romanticized vision of a pre-modern harmony contextualized within a modern epistemological and bureaucratic order. More than the programs of homogenizing and bureaucratization favored by Fuat and Medhat Pasha, this vision seems to correspond directly to the political credo of Mahmud Nedim Pasha, who served as Grand Vizier of the Ottoman Empire between 1871 and 1872, approximately the time when work on the publications destined for the Vienna Exposition must have been designed and executed. Critiquing the Tanzimat, Mahmud Nedim Pasha, quote, advocated an alternative system of government rooted in an idealized concept of early Ottoman history, unquote, in which the Sultan would serve as an all-powerful ruler, upholding the dominance of Islam over other religious communities, particularly through the modernizing rearticulation of the Sharia. In his view, the reforms of the Tanzimat had caused the empire to move away from the strengths of the early empire. Just as the articulation of early Ottoman architecture from Bursa in the book on architecture offers an idealized view of the Ottoman classical past as a model for modern imperial aesthetics, the reinforcement of communal difference within a vision of intercommunal harmony romanticizes the segregation of the past enabled through dress. While the works of 1873 can be understood as straightforward appropriation of European practices of representing colonial alterity through modern epistemological structures framing anachronistic representations of the East, this very articulation of Ottoman identity through anachronism stood in stark opposition to the modernizing, westernizing ethos of the Tanzimat and its homogenizing programs of reform. While the Elbise-i Osmaniye appears to celebrate religious diversity while proffering the Ottoman Empire as a modern colonial state, the realistic revival of this identity, rooted in the revival of heritage, would implicitly only be possible through the reinstitutionalization of a hierarchy of religious communities under the direction of a dominant Ottoman Muslim sovereign. And what I wanted to point out in this photograph is this is the only photograph of the 74 which has members of one community in it, and it has sort of two Sufi orders and one representative, presumably from the Sharia, and the Bektashi order had been eliminated in 1826. So his inclusion of that order as equivalent to the Mevlevi order, which was the preferred order of many Ottoman bureaucrats in an earlier era, again, indicates a very subtle political statement which would not be comprehensible to the Western viewer. So on to, I hope we're okay on time? Yeah? Yeah? Okay. This will be a little bit more than 2 or 3 minutes, but okay. Yeah. So on to the Abdülhamid albums. 20 years later, the Ottoman Empire again used photography to present a vision of imperial identity on an international stage at the Chicago World Exposition of 1893. And I don't actually know how these photographs were exhibited, or I don't know that. In many ways, the practice of display was very different. Unlike the project of 1873, this project relied solely on captioned photographs organized in albums, not on a coterie of extensive texts which contextualized them. Rather than emphasizing Ottoman mastery over European scholarly practices, the albums emphasized Ottoman mastery of modern technologies, both through the places and people on display in the albums and through the vast documentary enterprise entailed in the photographs themselves. And one can think of this as parallel to the whole discussion of should we adopt culture or should we adopt technology? Here we've clearly adopted technology. Yet like the earlier work, the albums presented by Sultan Abdülhamid offered a representation of Ottoman modernity in which Turkish Muslim dominion prevailed, despite the homogenizing ethos of the early Tanzimat. In this sense, despite the dominant, disparate emphasis on tradition versus modernity in the two compilations, the underlying emphasis on an Ottoman state dominated by an elite Turkish Muslim center persists. Although the albums comprise a multitude of representational genres, described by William Allen as landscape vistas, historical monuments, and scenes that depict current educational, industrial, and military developments, comparison with the Elbise Osmaniye is most apt in its representation of human subjects through ethnographic style documentation of students at the proliferating modern schools of the empire, replacing the tripartite diversity of the earlier frames with double portraits of students that emphasize their identity as Ottoman citizens rather than as individuals or sample members of religious communities. The photographs maintain the ethnographic distance and invisible panoptic eye of the state initiated in the earlier album. Although in contrast to the Elbise Osmaniye, the 1893 albums make absolutely no mention of religious identity. This needs to be understood less as a homogenization of religious identity under the equality offered by citizenship than by the increasing distinction between religious communities engendered by differential educational opportunities that led to differential integration into the Ottoman bureaucracy. As Fatma Göçek points out, in the late 19th century, Muslim and non-Muslim elites both benefited from the increasing availability of Western educational practices. However, while Ottoman minorities generally received education in foreign and exclusively minority schools, Ottoman Muslims were educated within a growing system of state schools. As a result, while non-Muslim subjects began to perceive themselves in proto-national terms that led to a desire to separate from the empire, modern Muslim subjects sought reform within the general structure of empire. The uniformization of Ottoman education was enabled through the growth of an integrated educational system. Between 1876 and 1909, the number of secondary schools across the empire rose from 250 to 600, and the number of primary schools from 5 to 104, with particular growth in the Arab provinces. Thus, the photographs we see of students at elementary, high, military, and medical schools represent not simply a neutral Ottoman citizenry, but the modern Muslim subject who is largely excluded from the vision of the 1873 album. As represented here, the empire no longer needed sartorial diversity to represent its unity because the dominion of the Muslim populace had implicitly been achieved. The translation of religious into ethnic groups, enabled through the Tanzimat reforms, further segregated Muslim and non-Muslim communities in the empire. And so these are more students. The implicit replacement of religious identity with inter-Muslim ethnic diversity is underscored by the only acknowledgement of diversity in the archive, documentation of the Imperial tribal school, Ashiret Mektebi Humayun, through a series of apparent before and after photographs. Operating between 1892 and 1907, the tribal school aimed to attract the sons of tribal notables in the peripheries of empire. Oh, sorry, I forgot to move forward. There we go. Those are the students at the tribal school. And that's the group photograph. Recycling them into a civilized, bureaucratic force loyal to the Sultan. Located in Istanbul, the school segregated young men from their local networks, offering them instead the glamour of the big city and loyalty to the state that hosted them. In contrast to the Elbise-i Osmaniye, which staged the Ottoman